Welcome to a journey into one of the most chilling and mysterious cases buried deep in American history. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you're watching from, because the story I'm about to share unfolds over a century ago in the shadowy heart of the North Carolina mountains. And even now, no one truly understands what happened to Nathaniel Burke. It's the year 1911. The Appalachian Mountains remain untouched by the rush of modern civilization, a place where dirt roads twist through fog, drenched valleys and peaks that seem to touch the heavens. Entire communities lived cut off from the rest of the world, their lives ruled by silence, superstition, and secrets that never reached the newspapers of the big cities. It was an isolated world, governed by its own unwritten laws, where the line between folklore and reality blurred under the canopy of ancient trees. Nathaniel Burke, aged 32, left his comfortable life in Richmond, Virginia, for the untamed wilderness to the south. He was a cartographer, meticulous, educated, and disciplined, hired by a railroad company to chart new routes through Appalachia. Every inch of his work was carefully documented. He recorded temperatures, terrain types, local encounters, even the direction of the streams. His habit of precision would later become the only reason anyone knew what befell him in those cursed mountains. In early March, Nathaniel set out from Asheville with supplies for 3 weeks and a single companion, a local guide named Ezra Whitlock. Ezra knew the mountains like the back of his weathered hand, but was a man of few words. Their destination was Madison County, near the remote settlement of Shelton Laurel, a region whispered about for its treacherous ravines, hidden caves, and old stories best left untold. For the first few days, the expedition seemed routine. The diary describes cold mountain air, trees bare from winter, and the constant rush of streams echoing through narrow valleys. But on the 5th day, everything began to change. They stumbled upon an abandoned hut perched on a hilltop. Nathaniel wrote that it looked as though whoever lived there had left in a great hurry. Utensils scattered, a pot still on the stove, and damp clothes hanging half, rotted from the ceiling beams. Ezra refused to go inside. He muttered something about bad stories, tied to that place, and insisted they move on. But Nathaniel, ever the man of science, couldn't resist. He entered the cabin, unaware that his curiosity was about to unravel something far beyond reason. In his notes, he describes finding strange carvings covering the inner walls, primitive symbols gouged deep into the wood, forming spiral and circular patterns he could not understand. He even drew them in his journal. Beneath a loose floorboard, he discovered a hidden compartment. He didn't describe what was inside, only wrote, "I found something Ezra must see. I believe this cabin was not abandoned. It was left behind for a reason." After that, the tone of Nathaniel's diary changes dramatically. His writing becomes uneven, hurried, sentences left unfinished. On the 6th day, he wrote that Ezra had grown restless, constantly looking over his shoulder, whispering that they should descend the mountains at once. Nathaniel argued, saying they had more work to do and that the company was expecting results. Ezra's reply was haunting. "There are places in these mountains no map can show, places where good men don't go." By the 7th night, the forest itself seemed to turn against them. Nathaniel recorded that he heard voices echoing through the valleys, not quite human, and not carried by any wind. They seemed, he wrote, to come from inside the earth itself. By dawn, Ezra Whitlock was gone. His rifle pack and food remained, but there was no sign of struggle, no footprints leading away. It was as though he had been swallowed whole by the forest. Alone now, Nathaniel faced a terrible choice. Instead of turning back, he pressed deeper into the wilderness. Perhaps it was duty, perhaps pride, or perhaps, as some have speculated, something in those mountains had already begun to draw him in. The later entries grow increasingly fragmented. He describes finding footprints that didn't match human feet, the sense of being watched from behind the trees, and fleeting shadows that seemed to move without sound. On the 10th day, he found another structure, a kind of stone shrine built into the side of a cliff, half hidden by moss and vines. Inside were objects he could barely describe, bones arranged in circles, dark stains on the rocks, and more of those same symbols, this time carved into the stone itself. Nathaniel's writing trembles as he lists these discoveries. He knew he had uncovered something ancient, something that wasn't meant to be seen by outsiders. His final complete entry, dated March 23, 1911, reads, "I must return. There are things here that should not exist, things older than the mountains themselves. I have taken evidence with me. It must be shown. It must be stopped." What happened after that remains a mystery. Nathaniel Burke was never seen again. The fragments of his diary were found months later, half buried near a dry creek bed. Of the evidence he claimed to have taken, none was ever recovered. but locals still whisper about the voices that rise from the valleys of Shelton Laurel when the wind turns cold. Voices that echo from beneath the ground, just as Nathaniel described. And they say that if you listen long enough on certain nights, you can still hear a man calling for help. A man who never made it out of those mountains. Would you like me to continue this story into what happens after Nathaniel's disappearance, like the later investigations or legends that followed? 6 weeks later, a fur trapper named Thomas Hargrove stumbled upon the only remaining trace of Burke's ill-fated expedition. Thomas was following deer trails deep in the forests of Madison County when he noticed something strange. Torn pieces of fabric caught on the thorns of wild blackberry bushes, forming a crude, broken trail that led down toward a narrow, shadowed valley. Intrigued and uneasy, he followed it. At the bottom of the slope, half buried beneath wet leaves and twisted roots, he found a leather backpack. Inside were several curious items, a partially completed map, surveying instruments, and a small canvas pouch containing objects Thomas later described to the sheriff as things that didn't belong in any man's pack. Strange things that made no sense at all. But the most important discovery was the diary. The same diary that chronicled Nathaniel's slow descent into the unknown. When Thomas brought it to the town of Marshall, the county seat, authorities initially dismissed the case. Men went missing in the Appalachians all the time. That was simply the way of those mountains. One slip could send you falling into a ravine. A sudden storm could erase your tracks, and bears still prowled the backwoods. The mountains were beautiful, but they were also merciless. To most people, it was just another accident, but Sheriff Edmund Calloway wasn't. Most people. A retired federal marshal with decades of experience, he had seen enough to know when something didn't add up. He read every page of the diary, the meticulous maps, the careful notes, and then the final pages filled with erratic handwriting, accounts of strange symbols, abandoned huts, and a stone shrine hidden in the cliffs. Those words troubled him deeply. Because Edmund knew these mountains, he'd grown up among their shadows, listening to stories told in hushed voices by elders who warned of places no one should go, places where even the animals refused to tread. Within a week, Edmund assembled a search party of 12 men, including Thomas Hargrove, to guide them. They set out one fog-soaked morning in early May, carrying rifles, lanterns, and enough provisions for several days. The forest greeted them with silence. Heavy, suffocating silence. It took them 3 long days just to reach the area Nathaniel's journal described. The trails had all but vanished, swallowed by thick spring growth. On the 4th day, they finally found signs of Nathaniel Burke. In a small clearing surrounded by towering pines, they came across what was left of his camp. The tent was ripped apart, its stakes yanked from the ground as if something had torn through it with violent force. Cooking utensils lay scattered in every direction. His rifle leaned untouched against a tree, loaded, but never fired. Clothes lay half buried in moss and mud, soaked by weeks of rain. But there was no blood, no body, no tracks leading away, just chaos, frozen in time. Then, one of the men, William Jessup, called out from the edge of the clearing. He'd found something in the damp soil, footprints. But not normal ones. They resembled human feet in shape, yet they were far too large. The impressions too deep, as if made by something impossibly heavy. Even more unsettling, the prints circled the camp again and again, as though whatever it was had been watching for a long time before it struck. Sheriff Calloway ordered the men to follow the tracks. They led downhill, weaving through denser forest until the group reached a narrow canyon where a cold stream wound between moss-covered stones. And there, beside a shallow bend in the creek where the water pooled into a black mirror, they found another of Nathaniel's possessions. His tool belt, still intact but torn apart in places where thick leather had been ripped clean through. James Porter, a veteran of the Spanish-American War, examined it closely and said quietly, "This wasn't torn by claws or teeth. Whatever did this used force, deliberate force." The group fell silent. For the first time, even the bravest among them began to feel that something unnatural was at play. Sheriff Calloway made a hard decision. Half of the group would return to Marshall for reinforcements and supplies, and to bring back a professional tracker. The remaining 6, including himself, would continue the search. A few men hesitated, clearly eager to leave, but none dared to voice it aloud. The air around them felt heavier with each step, as if the forest itself was watching. As the others descended the mountain, Edmund and his small team pushed upstream, deeper into the wilderness. The terrain grew wilder. The trees were ancient, their trunks wide enough that 3 men couldn't wrap their arms around them. The canopy above was so thick it turned day into dusk. The sound of the stream echoed strangely, bouncing in all directions until it became impossible to tell where it came from. Then, suddenly, Thomas Hargrove stopped in his tracks. He raised a trembling hand and pointed toward the cliffside to their right. At first, no one saw it. Then, slowly, through the tangle of vines and creeping ivy, they made it out. A structure built directly into the face of the cliff. It was covered in moss and shadow, half swallowed by nature itself. Stones stacked with unnatural precision, forming what looked like an archway or an entrance leading into darkness. None of them spoke. The forest seemed to hold its breath, and Sheriff Calloway, with his lantern raised and his voice barely steady, muttered the words that every man there would remember for the rest of his life. "Gentlemen, I think we've found what Burke was talking about." It was not a natural formation. The stones had been stacked with deliberate care, forming a low wall that curved gently against the cliff face. Just as Nathaniel Burke had described in his final diary entries, the men stood in tense silence, staring upward as a cold wind swept through the trees, carrying with it the faint scent of moss and wet earth. Getting to the structure was no easy task. They had to climb steep slopes slick with mud, gripping exposed roots and jagged rocks, every misstep threatening a deadly fall. But Sheriff Edmund Calloway pressed on, driven by something that felt less like duty and more like obsession. By the time they reached the plateau where the shrine stood, all 6 men were breathing hard, their clothes torn and damp with sweat. For a long while no one spoke. The place was small, perhaps 3 meters wide, 2 deep, like a crude stone alcove carved into the mountain itself. Yet every man there could feel that this place was not meant for human eyes. Inside, arranged in eerie symmetry, were bones. Dozens of them. They were not human, that much was clear, but the way they were placed in perfect circular patterns gave the impression of ritual rather than nature. Deer, bear, fox, even what seemed to be the bones of a large cat, all bleached white and weathered, yet laid out with meticulous precision, as though part of a ceremony whose purpose had long been forgotten. The walls surrounding the shrine were covered in symbols, not paint, but deep carvings etched into the stone. They weren't Cherokee or from any indigenous tribe Edmund knew of. He had lived his entire life among these mountains, spoken with the few remaining elders, and heard their legends. But these symbols were older, or perhaps entirely alien, interwoven lines and spirals that seemed to shift meaning the longer one looked. Reverend Samuel Yates, the Methodist minister traveling with the group, dropped to his knees and murmured a trembling prayer. "This place bears the mark of the profane," he whispered, clutching his Bible tightly. "Such things have no right to exist in God's country." Then Edmund noticed something half buried in the dirt near the center of the shrine. A book. It was small and bound in cracked, dark leather, the pages yellowed and swollen from moisture. When he brushed off the dust, the sheriff immediately realized it was not Nathaniel Burke's diary. This one was far older. The script within was frantic and tight, written in an archaic form of English that suggested it dated back at least a century earlier. Under the dim light filtering through the vines above, Edmund began to read. What he saw there, no one ever truly knew. He would later claim that he could not make full sense of it, that much of the writing was incoherent. But the men who stood with him that day remembered the look on his face, how his expression hardened, how his hands began to tremble slightly as he turned each page. Without saying a word, Edmund snapped the book shut, slipped it into his own pack, and ordered in a low but firm voice, "We're leaving now, before sundown." The men exchanged uneasy glances. The descent was treacherous, even in daylight. Night was already creeping down the ridges, turning the forest below into an ocean of shadow. Traveling in darkness would be suicide. Reluctantly, they convinced the sheriff to camp at the base of the cliff, near the stream. They built a large fire and pitched 2 tents, arranging themselves in a tight circle. No one spoke much. The air was unnaturally still, the forest around them silent, no crickets, no owls, nothing. Reverend Yates sat by the flames, reading his Bible under his breath, lips moving soundlessly. Thomas Hargrove never took his hand off his rifle, his eyes fixed on the blackness beyond the light's edge. Sheriff Calloway simply sat there, staring into the fire, occasionally glancing at the backpack that now held the mysterious leather-bound book, as though it weighed far more than its size suggested. Hours passed. Then, around 3 in the morning, William Jessup, who was on watch, hissed a sharp whisper. "Something's up there." Everyone froze. At first there was nothing but the constant murmur of the stream. Then they heard it, faint but unmistakable. A sound from above, slow, deliberate footsteps, stones shifting. Something, heavy, moving near the shrine. The sound of sliding gravel echoed through the canyon. Edmund raised his flashlight and aimed it toward the cliff. The beam barely reached the height of the stone structure, but for a split second, a fraction of a heartbeat, all of them saw it. A figure. A silhouette framed against the stone shrine, tall and indistinct, standing utterly still. It wasn't human, or at least not entirely. There was something wrong with its proportions, something off in the way it moved. And then, as soon as the light touched it, the figure vanished, slipping backward into the shadows without a sound. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the stream seemed to go quiet. No one dared to sleep after that. They kept the fire blazing until it burned with blinding brightness, feeding it with every scrap of wood they could find. They spoke little, whispering old mountain stories to fill the crushing stillness. Tales of travelers who vanished into the mist, of cabins left full of food and clothes but no people, of strange lights seen moving through the forest on moonless nights. Stories they had always dismissed as backwoods superstition now carried a terrifying weight. By dawn they were pale, exhausted, and shaken to their core. As the grey mist rolled through the valley, Edmund gave the order none of them needed to hear. They were leaving. The descent took 2 days. They barely spoke, moving with grim determination until at last, mud-streaked and hollow-eyed, they reached Marshall. There, they found the first group waiting with 15 new volunteers, and a reporter from the Asheville Gazette, eager for a story about the mysterious disappearance of a railroad cartographer. But when the reporter asked what they'd found up there, Edmund Calloway didn't answer. He simply looked past him, toward the mountains still shrouded in fog, and muttered quietly. Some things in those hills were buried for a reason. Edmund Calloway refused to give the reporter a single word. His face was pale, his hands still trembling faintly from whatever he had seen in the mountains. Without pause, he made his way straight to the office of Judge Albert Morrison, the county's most respected figure, a man of stern principles and calm authority, who served as both magistrate and moral compass for Madison County. The two men locked themselves in the judge's office for 3 full hours. No one was allowed inside. Not even the clerk dared to knock. When they finally emerged, both looked as though they'd aged years. Edmund's eyes were hollow, and Judge Morrison's usual composure had vanished. Within the hour, Morrison had summoned an emergency council. The mayor, the town's leading pastor, Dr. Whitmore, and several of the county's wealthiest landowners. They gathered that same evening in the courthouse, behind closed doors. The townsfolk saw the lights burning until well past midnight, but were given no word of what was discussed. What emerged from that secret meeting, however, was an official decree. There would be another expedition. But this one would not be a local search party of frightened volunteers. It would be a state-sanctioned investigation, equipped, organized, and led by professionals. The sheriff's discovery, and the book he'd brought back, had convinced the council that something far more serious than a missing explorer was buried in those hills. That night, Judge Morrison drafted a telegram to Governor William Kitten in Raleigh. He chose his words carefully, omitting the more disturbing details but stressing the urgency of the matter: 2 men missing, strange findings in the mountains, and possible signs of criminal or cultic activity. The governor's response arrived 3 days later. He authorized the operation immediately. A detachment of 10 state militiamen would accompany the expedition, along with a special investigator from the capital, a man by the name of Henry Blackwood. Henry Blackwood arrived in Marshall on June 12, 1911. He was not what the townsfolk expected. Tall, clean-cut, dressed in a dark suit rather than a uniform. He carried with him a quiet air of precision and boxes of modern equipment that seemed almost foreign to the simple mountain town. Inside them were cameras, surveying tools, forensic instruments, and even a primitive sound recording device, a marvel few in Marshall had ever seen. Blackwood had built a reputation across North Carolina for solving baffling rural disappearances, and for his methodical, almost scientific approach to superstition. Before setting foot in the mountains, he spent an entire week interviewing everyone connected to the case. He began with Thomas Hargrove, who described how he'd found Nathaniel Burke's pack near the ridge. Then Reverend Yates, whose account of the shrine left the investigator visibly unsettled. Finally, he interrogated Sheriff Calloway himself for nearly 6 hours behind closed doors. Afterward, Henry examined Nathaniel's diary, reading it page by page and making meticulous notes. Then came the moment he had been waiting for, when Edmund reluctantly handed him the leather-bound book taken from the shrine. Blackwood locked himself in his boarding house room for 2 nights, studying it under lamplight. When he emerged, he carried a stack of handwritten notes and an expression that mixed fascination with quiet dread. According to his preliminary report, the ancient volume appeared to be a record or chronicle kept by a small group that had once lived deep within those mountains, perhaps in the early 1800s. The text was disjointed, filled with archaic phrasing and long, frantic passages that described rituals and beliefs unlike any known religion or folklore. Henry used one word in his notes: cult, an isolated sect, hidden from the world, performing rites that even he refused to fully detail in his official documents. But what chilled him most was not the book's original content. It was the later additions. The last few pages had been written in fresh ink, in a different hand. The entries were hurried, desperate, and, according to Henry's analysis, dated only days before Nathaniel Burke's disappearance. Henry managed to decipher a few lines. They're still here. The symbols are warnings, not decorations. Ezra knew. That's why he ran. They're not stories. They're records. The final entry, written with what seemed to be a trembling hand, read, "If anyone finds this, do not go up at night." It was unmistakably Nathaniel Burke's handwriting. Henry presented his findings to Judge Morrison and Sheriff Calloway in a closed meeting the next morning. His theory was both rational and terrifying. There was evidence that a remnant of that ancient cult still existed. Descendants who had survived in isolation for generations, cut off from civilization and determined to keep their existence secret. The symbols, the bone arrangements, the shrine, all pointed to a community that guarded its rituals fiercely. As for the missing men, Blackwood speculated that Ezra Whitlock, being a local, may have known or even descended from that hidden group. He might have fled when Nathaniel's exploration threatened to uncover what should have remained buried. Or perhaps, Henry suggested, Ezra's role had been to watch and mislead outsiders, ensuring they never went too far. Nathaniel Burke, however, had crossed a line, stumbling into something the mountain dwellers deemed sacred. Whether he was captured, killed, or driven mad, Blackwood could not say. By early July, the final expedition was ready. 25 men in all. 10 from the state militia, Sheriff Edmund Calloway, and 5 local volunteers, Henry Blackwood, and 2 assistants, 7 hired porters and guides carrying tents, supplies, and recording equipment. It was the largest organized expedition ever mounted in western North Carolina. They prepared for 2 full weeks in the field, bringing food, rifles, cameras, maps, and even small charges of dynamite to clear paths through blocked canyons or rockfalls. They departed Marshall on the morning of July 6, 1911, under a cloudless sky. Half the town came to watch. Some waved flags, others crossed themselves silently. Mothers clutched their children as the column disappeared up the mountain road. Before leaving, an elderly woman known locally as Mother Thornton stopped Henry Blackwood near the edge of town. She gripped his hand with surprising strength and whispered, "The mountains hold what the mountains take. You won't find what you're looking for, but you'll find something." Henry smiled politely, writing the words in his notebook as a curious example of mountain superstition. He never realized how true they were. The first 5 days passed quietly, too quietly. There were no strange noises, no unexplained sights, and no sudden vanishings. The men moved with steady rhythm through the forest, following the same trails that Edmund and his earlier team had mapped weeks before. They reached the remnants of Nathaniel Burke's ruined camp, and later, the narrow gorge where his tool belt had been discovered. Henry Blackwood documented everything with obsessive precision. He measured distances with tape and compass, photographed every angle of the torn tent and scattered equipment, and collected soil and fabric samples for later study. He wasn't content with stories. He was building a case file, a proper dossier of evidence he could one day lay before the state as proof of what had happened in those mountains. The militia, meanwhile, built discipline into their survival. They erected a fortified base camp near the creek, keeping fires burning day and night. Guards rotated in 4-hour shifts, rifles always close at hand. In the wilderness, routine became their armor against the unknown. Then came the 6th day. That morning they reached the cliff of the stone shrine, the same place where Edmund had once found the ancient book. This time, they climbed better prepared ropes, pulleys, and twice the number of men. The ascent was difficult but far safer than before. When they reached the ledge, Edmund felt his breath tighten in his chest. The shrine looked exactly as it had weeks ago. The same cold stones, the same circular arrangement of animal bones, untouched and still, too still. The strange symbols carved into the walls remained as sharp as ever, undisturbed by wind or time. But something new awaited them. In the center of the grotto, where Edmund had once unearthed the old leather-bound journal, now lay another object. A familiar one. It was Nathaniel Burke's sketchbook. The cover was damp, the corners curled from moisture. It had been placed there deliberately, open to a specific page. The one where Nathaniel had copied the cryptic symbols from the first abandoned hut he'd found. And across that drawing, written hastily in thick strokes of charcoal, were 2 simple words, GOWY. The effect on the group was immediate. Arguments broke out, whispers and shouts overlapping. Some men insisted this was proof that someone was watching them, that whoever lived in these mountains knew exactly where they were. Others, pale, faced and shaking, said they should take the warning at face value and leave while they still could. Henry Blackwood remained composed. Kneeling by the sketchbook, he studied the writing carefully. The letters were crude, uneven, not Nathaniel's. Whoever wrote this, he said quietly, wasn't accustomed to writing at all. The hand is untrained, perhaps self-taught. That simple observation chilled them more than any threat could have. It supported Henry's growing theory that an isolated group of people lived deep in these woods, descendants of that long-forgotten cult, untouched by civilization for generations. He made his decision. They would stay, but precautions would double. Night guards increased from 2 to 4. Every man was ordered to keep his weapon loaded. Torches and fires were to remain lit at all times after dusk. That night, the men camped once again at the base of the cliff. Nothing happened. No footsteps in the dark. No distant howls. No movement at all. The silence, however, was wrong. It pressed against them like a weight, unnatural, hollow. By midnight, even the insects had gone still. Some men relaxed, trying to joke about the eerie peace, suggesting perhaps their presence had frightened off whoever left the warning. But Edmund sat quietly, his face grim. He knew these woods. He knew that when the forest fell completely silent, it meant something else was near, something bigger, something waiting. On the 7th day, Henry ordered the team to divide. Half the men, the militia and a few locals, would remain at the fortified camp, maintaining a defensive perimeter. The other half, led by Henry Edmund and the most experienced soldiers, would conduct wide-circle explorations radiating outward from the shrine, their goal to find any further signs of habitation, structures, or evidence connected to Nathaniel or Ezra. Each team would move in groups of at least 5, keeping within earshot of a signal shot should anything go wrong. It was Edmund's group that made the discovery. Roughly 2 miles from base camp, they followed what looked like an old game trail, barely visible beneath moss and fallen leaves. The forest grew thicker here, darker, quieter. Then, through the dense green, they saw it. A clearing, hidden beneath a canopy of ancient trees. There were no houses, no cabins. Instead, they found a series of makeshift shelters, crude structures made from branches, bark and leaves, cleverly camouflaged to disappear into the wilderness. Smoke-blackened stones marked old fire pits. Scattered bones, animal in shape, lay around them, cracked open for marrow. Someone had lived here, recently. Edmund examined the site carefully. The shelters could have housed a dozen people, maybe more. But what made his skin crawl wasn't their number. It was their arrangement. They formed a semicircle, all facing the same central point, a large flat slab of stone. Its surface was stained dark, not just from dirt or moss, but something deeper soaked in. Something that might have been blood, though time and weather had faded the truth. Around that rock, laid out with unnatural precision, were white stones arranged into the same kinds of symbols carved in the shrine. One of the soldiers, a young man named Robert Lee, shouted for Edmund to come. He'd found something beneath a mound of leaves. It was a piece of torn fabric, stiff from moisture but still identifiable. Edmund turned it over in his hands and froze. He recognized the color instantly. That deep navy blue cotton favored by engineers and surveyors. The same fabric described in the report about Nathaniel Burke's clothing when he vanished. Soon, more pieces surfaced, shredded cloth, a brass button, and most telling of all, a small surveying instrument, a cracked pocket theodolite, one of the precision tools Nathaniel had carried. He had been here, in this place. But again, no body, no bones, no trace of what had become of him. When Henry arrived 2 hours later, summoned by the sound of the signal shots echoing across the valley, he stood for a long moment without speaking. His eyes traced the stone, the shelters, the arrangement of symbols. Then he murmured, almost to himself, this wasn't a camp. He paused, lowering his voice. It was a judgment ground. The words hung heavy in the humid mountain air, and every man there felt it. They weren't searching for the past anymore. The past was watching them. The discovery inside the cave sent a chill through the entire group. The object, wrapped in tanned leather, revealed not a complete skeleton, but a carefully arranged collection of human bones. A partial skull, fragments of ribs, finger bones, and vertebrae. Each bone had been etched with the same strange symbols they had seen throughout the region. The arrangement was deliberate, almost ceremonial, as though whoever had placed them there had done so with a specific ritual purpose. Henry stood in silence, the lantern light flickering across the cold stone walls. For a moment, the usual logic that guided his thinking faltered. Every bone, every mark, every carefully placed stone spoke of something ancient, not just superstition, but a system of belief far older than the region itself. He took a deep breath, forcing himself back to his analytical mindset. He ordered Frederick to photograph everything in detail and to collect samples of the markings for later study. As the men worked, Edmund stood near the cave entrance, his unease growing. He had explored many parts of these mountains throughout his life, but he had never encountered anything like this. The sense that they were being watched. The way the air seemed to hum faintly in the silence, like the echo of distant movement. When they finally emerged from the cave, night had already begun to fall, and an unnatural stillness hung over the forest. Even the wind had stopped. Back at camp, Henry gathered the men again to review what they had found. The bones, the symbols, the layout of the caves. Everything suggested the existence of an isolated community with rituals and customs that defied modern explanation. Still, Henry refused to indulge in talk of the supernatural. What we're dealing with, he said firmly, is a group of people who have lived cut off from civilization for generations. Their practices may appear primitive or even disturbing, but they are human, and they can be found. Despite his words, few of the men slept that night. Strange noises echoed faintly from the forest. Distant footsteps, the crack of branches, and what sounded like low murmurs carried by the wind. When morning came, one of the guards reported seeing movement near the creek during the night, but nothing conclusive. Henry dismissed it as nerves, though he himself had woken several times uneasy without knowing why. Over the next days they continued to map the region, discovering that the caves, shelters, and ritual sites formed a loose circle surrounding their base camp. Whatever this group was, whoever they were, they had been watching. The realization unsettled even the most disciplined of men. Henry's reports became increasingly methodical, but between the lines, his writing betrayed the growing tension. Logic was still his shield, but each new discovery chipped away at it. The final straw came when they returned to the clearing of the shelters on the 10th day. The place had changed. The stones that formed the symbols around the central rock had been rearranged during their absence, not destroyed, but shifted into new shapes. And at the center of the stone, where before there had been only dark stains, there now lay a single, unmistakable object, a freshly severed deer's head, placed upright as if watching the forest around it. Someone had been there. Someone was warning them again, or perhaps inviting them deeper. Henry, for the first time, said nothing. He simply stared at the scene, his jaw tight, his knuckles white around the handle of his notebook. The logic he relied on was beginning to crumble under the weight of what surrounded them. Instead, he ordered everyone to hold their fire and maintain discipline. The flickering lights in the woods were now close enough that their movement could be seen clearly, swaying, rhythmic, almost coordinated. They weren't the erratic motions of people carrying torches in haste. They moved with purpose, forming a line that curved around the camp like a tightening noose. The air grew colder. Even the constant chirping of night insects had stopped. Only the soft crackling of the campfires and the faint crunch of footsteps in the distance broke the silence. Henry's voice, calm but firm, carried through the darkness again. "We mean no harm. We are investigators, not soldiers. We're here to talk." His words echoed uselessly into the void. Then, as if on cue, the lights stopped moving. They stood motionless between the trees, dozens of them scattered among the trunks, dim but steady. For nearly a full minute, nothing happened. The men waited, rifles raised but trembling slightly in their hands. It was Robert Lee who finally whispered, "They're watching us." No one could see faces, only faint silhouettes shifting behind the glow of the torches. Then came the sound. It started as a low hum, distant and indistinct, like the wind moaning through the branches. But it wasn't the wind. The sound grew, deepening into a chant, a sequence of guttural syllables repeated in slow, deliberate rhythm. The words were unintelligible, but the tone carried an ancient, almost ceremonial weight. The soldiers began to panic. One of them muttered a prayer, another checked his rifle's chamber. Henry tried to stay composed, even as his heartbeat pounded in his ears. He turned to Edmund and whispered, "If this is meant to scare us, it's working." Edmund's eyes never left the tree line. "They're not trying to scare us," he said quietly. "They're warning us again." And then, the chanting stopped. The lights flickered once, twice, and then vanished, as though someone had snuffed out every flame at the same moment. The forest was plunged into absolute darkness. For several seconds, no one moved. Then the night exploded with noise. A scream came from the west perimeter, one of the guards shouting something before his voice was abruptly cut off. The camp erupted into chaos. Flashlights flicked on, rifles were raised, and men began shouting commands over one another. Henry tried to restore order, yelling for everyone to stay together, But confusion spread faster than control. They found the missing guard minutes later, lying near the edge of the woods. He was alive but unconscious, his face pale and blood smeared across his temple. When they revived him, all he could say was that something, or someone, had grabbed him from behind and dragged him toward the trees before he broke free. By dawn, the torches were gone, the forest silent again. The men were exhausted, jittery, and ready to leave. Henry finally gave the order to break camp and begin their descent. There was no more debate. Even Edmund, his earlier defiance gone, agreed that to stay would be madness. As they began their march back down the mountain, Henry paused for one last look at the misty ridgeline above. In the dim morning light, he could swear he saw movement among the trees, small figures watching from a distance, motionless as shadows. He turned away and continued down the trail. The expedition was over, but the questions remained. Questions that no one would ever truly answer. What lived in those mountains? What ancient beliefs had taken root there, hidden from the modern world? And how many more bones lay buried beneath the cold Appalachian soil, silently guarding their secrets? A region that now felt less like part of North Carolina, and more like a forgotten world trapped between centuries. He spoke to shepherds who grazed their flocks near the foothills, to widows who swore they heard chanting carried on the wind during certain nights, and to trappers who refused to hunt beyond a certain ridge, because of what they called the watchers in the trees. Each story, though different in detail, carried the same warning: some places were never meant to be found. As the days passed, Henry filled an entire ledger with these testimonies, fragmented memories of strange lights, of missing livestock found arranged in unnatural patterns, of voices echoing in valleys where no human was supposed to be. Though he tried to approach each account scientifically, he couldn't ignore the pattern that was emerging. Something or someone had always been there. Something older than the county itself, woven into the land like the roots of its ancient oaks. One evening, while reviewing his notes by lamplight in his rented room at the boarding house, Henry noticed something odd. Among the items Edmund had collected during the expedition, scraps of paper, sketches, fragments of fabric, there was a torn page that didn't seem to belong to Nathaniel Burke's diary, or to the mysterious old book found in the stone shrine. It was thicker, darker, and smelled faintly of oil and age. Upon closer inspection, he realized it was written in the same strange hand that had scrawled "Go away" over Nathaniel's sketches. The page contained what looked like a list, not of names, but of symbols arranged in sequences, each accompanied by what seemed like dates. Some of the dates corresponded to known disappearances in the area: 1889, 1896, 1904, and finally 1911, the year of Nathaniel Burke's expedition. Next to it, one word was written in English: completed. Henry stared at the page for a long time, a chill crawling up his spine. Was this a record of victims, of rituals completed, or was it some kind of calendar marking cyclical events tied to their beliefs? He didn't know. But he knew that whoever had written this was still out there. When he showed the page to Edmund the next morning, the sheriff turned pale. "Then it's not over," Edmund said quietly. "Whatever they're doing, it continues." Henry nodded grimly. "And no one is coming to stop it." The following week, Henry packed his belongings and left Marshall, promising Edmund that he would return one day, when the state or federal government was ready to take the case seriously. But deep down, he doubted that day would ever come. The world was moving on, cities growing, wars brewing in Europe. The mysteries of one hidden valley in the Appalachians were already fading into irrelevance. Yet, before leaving, he made one last stop: the stone courthouse where Judge Morrison worked. He left behind 2 sealed envelopes. One was addressed to the judge, containing a copy of all his notes and photographs. The other was labeled simply, "To be opened only if more men disappear." Then, without ceremony, he boarded the morning train to Raleigh and vanished into the hum of government work and bureaucracy. Another man swallowed by the quiet indifference of the early 20th century. Months passed. Life in Marshall slowly returned to normal. The townsfolk spoke less and less of the expedition, as though silence could erase the unease that had settled over the region. The only one who continued to visit the mountains was Edmund Calloway. He went alone, always taking the same route, always returning before nightfall. When people asked him why, he'd simply say, "To make sure the line holds." But in late autumn of that same year, something happened that reopened every wound. A group of loggers working near the northern edge of the county reported hearing drums at night. Slow, distant, echoing through the ridges. When they went to investigate the next morning, they found their camp ransacked. Nothing was stolen, but every tree around the clearing had been marked with the same intertwined symbol carved deep into the bark. Word reached Edmund, and then Judge Morrison. Letters were sent to rally to Henry Blackwood himself. But Henry never replied. He had resigned from his post and disappeared from public record entirely. Some said he had gone west. Others whispered that he had gone back into the mountains, unable to resist the pull of what he had left unfinished. Years later, during the harsh winter of 1919, a prospector found a rusted camera case near a stream high in the Appalachians, roughly 20 miles north of Marshall. Inside, protected by layers of decayed oilcloth, were several glass photo plates, fragile but still intact. When developed, they revealed blurred images of trees, symbols carved into stone, and one photo that no one could explain. It showed a group of figures standing in a cave, partially obscured by shadow. Their faces were indistinct, but their eyes seemed to reflect the light unnaturally, like those of animals caught in a lantern beam. The prospector turned the photos into the county, and they were quietly added to the old Burke file. But no one spoke of them again. The folder was sealed and placed deep in the courthouse archives, where it remains to this day. And the mountains, those same mountains that had swallowed Nathaniel Burke, Ezra Whitlock, and perhaps Henry Blackwood himself, continue to rise in silence against the horizon. The locals still say that sometimes, on windless nights when the air is heavy and the woods are still, you can see faint lights moving along the ridges, like lanterns carried by unseen hands, winding through the trees in a slow, deliberate procession. And if you listen closely, when the world is quiet enough, you might still hear it. That voice from the darkness, speaking in an accent that time forgot. You have been told to leave. Regions mentioned in his diary seemed to have vanished into the wilderness, as if the land itself had shifted to erase all traces of what once stood there. The old markers, the stone shrine, and even the trails Henry had meticulously mapped were gone, swallowed by time and nature. The group returned with little more than a few photographs of unfamiliar carvings on rocks, and a growing sense of unease that deepened the mystery rather than solved it. Over the following decades, more attempts were made to uncover the truth behind the people of the heights. Journalists, historians, and amateur explorers were drawn to Madison County, hoping to find some remnant of the hidden community. Yet none succeeded. The few who ventured too far into the remote regions often returned with stories of being watched, of hearing strange chanting at night, or of lights moving silently between the trees, and some never returned at all. By the late 20th century, the story of Nathaniel Burke had become part of Appalachian folklore, blending fact and fiction until no one could clearly tell where one ended and the other began. Locals spoke of the mountains as living entities, guardians of their own secrets. Some said the isolated community still existed, its descendants watching quietly from the ridgelines, ensuring that their ancestors' sanctuary remained untouched. Others dismissed it as superstition, a tale to keep tourists and treasure hunters away from dangerous terrain. In 1991, a state university team attempted one final documented expedition using modern equipment, drones, mapping tools, and satellite imaging. Their goal was to verify whether any settlements had ever existed in the uncharted valleys described in the old records. What they found was inconclusive, faint outlines beneath the dense canopy, possible remnants of structures or stone walls, but nothing definitive. And after one of their cameras captured a brief image of what appeared to be a torchlight deep in the forest, despite there being no recorded human presence for miles, the project was abruptly abandoned. To this day, the official record of North Carolina lists Nathaniel Burke's case as an unresolved disappearance during private expedition. But among the people of Madison County, the story is far from forgotten. On quiet nights, when the fog rolls through the valleys and the forests seem to whisper, some claim you can still see faint lights moving along the mountain slopes, as if those who once gave their final warning still stand guard, keeping their hidden world sealed away from the rest of humanity. And so the legend endures, a reminder that not all mysteries are meant to be solved, and that some corners of the world prefer to remain untouched, forever keeping their silence beneath the watchful eyes of the mountains. Over the 50 years that had passed, the Appalachian landscape had changed beyond recognition. Landslides reshaped the valleys, dense forests swallowed trails, and creeping moss covered anything once man-made. When the 1964 expedition ventured into the mountains, they found nothing, no shrine, no cave, no signs of human life. It was as though the earth itself had reclaimed everything Nathaniel Burke once saw. But on their final night, as the men camped near what they believed was Nathaniel's last site, something happened. From somewhere deep in the mountains came the faint sound of human voices, a chorus, singing in an unrecognizable tongue. The sound wasn't threatening, but ancient, haunting. It echoed through the trees for 15 long minutes before fading into silence. None of them spoke of it afterward, but the leader of the expedition wrote one final line in his private diary. There is something alive in these mountains besides animals and trees. Something old that has chosen to remain hidden. And perhaps it's better that way. In the decades that followed, as satellite imagery and digital mapping advanced, researchers turned to technology in hopes of solving the mystery. Occasionally, people claimed to spot strange clearings, geometric rock patterns, or shadowy shapes resembling trails on high-resolution scans of Madison County. But nothing definitive ever surfaced. The forest plays tricks with the eye, and even now, vast portions of the Appalachian wilderness remain uninhabited, untouched, and impenetrable. What really happened to Nathaniel Burke? Was he killed for desecrating sacred ground? Did he lose his way and meet a tragic, natural end? Or did he encounter something that defied all logical explanation, something meant never to be understood? Over a century later, we still have only fragments: Henry Blackwood's field notes, Edmund Calloway's reports, the recovered bones, and that cryptic diary with its last, unsettling entry about footsteps in the dark. Nathaniel's disappearance is a reminder of a forgotten truth about early 20th century America, that even as cities grew and technology advanced, there were still places beyond the grasp of civilization, places where old customs survived in silence, and where those who wandered too deep might find themselves facing histories older than the nation itself. Looking back, it's easy to ask why the governor never sent troops, or why Henry and Edmund didn't push harder. But they lived in a different era, one where the unknown was often left undisturbed, where fear and respect for the wilderness went hand in hand. Maybe they saw something they couldn't fully comprehend and simply chose not to provoke it further. The Appalachian Mountains remain timeless and indifferent. The rivers still carve through stone as they always have, trees still whisper in the wind, and somewhere beyond the reach of roads and signal towers, perhaps something still stirs, watching, waiting, keeping its silence. What we do know is that Nathaniel Burke, a 32-year-old cartographer from Richmond, set out in 1911 to map a region most men avoided and never returned. His diary survived. His belongings were found, but the man himself vanished, consumed by the same wilderness he sought to understand. In his quest to chart the unknown, Nathaniel became part of it. A legend whispered through generations, a warning to those who mistake discovery for safety. Some mysteries, it seems, aren't meant to be solved. They're meant to endure, like the mountains themselves. If this story drew you in, if the shadows of the Appalachian wilds still linger in your thoughts, join us as we continue uncovering the forgotten mysteries history tried to erase. Subscribe for more tales of the unknown. Leave a like if this journey gripped you till the end. And tell us, do you believe there are still hidden places in America where time stands still?